Okay, now let's talk about unsupervised learning. And here we go. Let's try in the first place to understand what the problem is. In the clustering problem, remember, we are talking about a situation where we have no labels. We don't know anything. We just have data. And so the framework is we are given a set of objects, quoted, unquoted. These are observations or whatever. And n is the number of these objects. And then we have a way to measure the similarities between pairs of objects. So basically, I have a similarity function which, given two objects, object number 1 and object number 2, it tells me how similar they are. In other words, we have a matrix A, an n by n matrix of pairwise similarities. Okay. This is the matrix version of the problem, but of course you can even think about this problem in terms of an edge-weighted graph, where I'm given a bunch of nodes connected by edges, and on the edges you will have a weight, and this weight measures the similarity between two nodes. These two perspectives are quite useful in the sense that sometimes it's useful to think the clustering problem in terms of a graph with nodes and edges and weights on the edges. On other occasions, it will be more convenient to think of the problem in terms of a matrix. So matrix against graphs, where the matrix tells you everything about the similarities. Now, of course, the two perspectives are equivalent in the sense that if you give me a matrix A, I can always build a corresponding graph, and vice versa. If you give me the graph, I can build a matrix. But sometimes knowing the matrix, it's more convenient than knowing the graph, and vice versa. So these things will be clear later. Now, what is the weights on the question is, how can we assign edge weights? The weights are the similarities between the objects. So here we are making the assumption that we have a way to measure the similarity between two objects. I'm going to give you one example in a few seconds, and then that similarity becomes the weight on the edge. So that's the assumption that we're making. So the goal is to partition the vertices of the graph G into maximally homogeneous groups. In other words, these maximally homogeneous groups are called the clusters. We are going to see what exactly this means, but for the moment, let's assume that a cluster is basically a subset of objects that are very similar to each other on the one hand, and on the other hand, they are dissimilar to the objects outside. That's the basic idea behind the cluster, and we're going to formalize this later. Well, there are some assumptions here that are made. One is that the similarity matrix A is symmetric, which basically means that the similarity between I and J is the same as the similarity between J and I. Or, if you like, that the graph G is undirected, which means that the edges have no direction. Okay. So here is a toy example how this works. The objects here are points on the plane. Each point, of course, can be considered as a pair of numbers, two coordinates, the x coordinate and the y coordinate. And here we measure the similarity based on the distance, on the Euclidean distance between points. Of course, the Euclidean distance between 2 points is the length of the segment joining the 2 points. So we have this distance measure. The smaller the distance, the more similar the objects are. And by using this notion of distance or similarity, we easily see that these data, they cluster into 4 different groups. Of course, this is one group, this is another group, that's the third one, and this is the fourth one. And you see that clusters are characterized by this notion that I mentioned before. So inside the cluster, all the objects are very similar to each other or very close to each other. And if we take points that belong to different clusters, say the point here and point here, they are very far away. And these are the two properties which characterize the notion of a cluster. Now, this is a simple example to solve. Of course, there might be possibly more complicated examples. For example, here we have 4 clusters. One is very big, the other ones are smaller than this. But even more difficult is this situation where the clusters have, how can I say, an elongated structure. We all recognize that here there are 4 clusters, the red one here, the blue one, the brown one, and the green one. Although, this situation might be a difficult one for some clustering algorithms because the structure of these clusters is non-convex. They are a very elongated form. And here is another situation where, there are some clusters which are compact and I would say spherical, if you want, and others that do not have this structure and have an elongated and arbitrarily shaped structure. Now, the clustering problem has been one of the main problems in machine learning in the past few decades. They can be found in a variety of problems, of course, in computer vision, image processing, but also bioinformatics, computational biology, signal processing, medical image analysis, document analysis. This is one of those problems that you find almost everywhere. And so it's very important to be able to develop algorithms that are efficient on the one hand, and also accurate in finding good clusters. Now, one of the problems that immediately arises when dealing with the clustering problem, and this problem reveals, in some sense, the slippery, I would say, notion of a cluster, because the clustering problem is indeed an ill-posed problem. Now, one first question is, how many clusters or how many groups should I extract from the cluster? Well, for example, let's ask ourselves, how many clusters do we see in this set, this data set consisting of a bunch of points? Well, probably we will say 4 clusters, right? There's one cluster here, there's another cluster here, there's another cluster here. Those 3 clusters are kind of compact, and there is another one, which is this one over here, right? Which has an elongated structure, by the way. Now, the answer looks natural. There are 4 clusters, but we should keep in mind, and that's something which is very important when it comes to clustering, that the notion of a cluster is a relative notion. The notion of a cluster depends on the scale that we want to use. And if we say here that there are 4 clusters, it's just because we are all using a kind of natural scale, I would say. But if we use a finer scale, then, for example, we might notice that, for example, this point here, in some sense, is a bit far away from all the other points here. So here, once again, I'm using a particular point here, right, which is far away from this. Now, if you take this one, well, you might see that a different scale, this one is a different cluster than this one. So one of the main problems related to clustering is that the scale that you choose for clustering your objects has usually an impact in terms of the number of clusters. And this is a problem that we are going to address later. Now, image segmentation, just talking about applications, image segmentation is one of the most popular applications of clustering. In this particular case, the problem is the following one. I give you a picture, an image like this one, And of course, you know that images contain pixels, is an array of pixels. Each pixel is associated with 3 numbers. If it's a color image, we have RGB. And then the problem becomes, how can I partition the pixels in my image in such a way that into each region we find pixels with the same or approximately the same color. So intuitively, for example, I expect that all these pixels that represent the grass, and of course they are green, they will belong to the same region because the color is very similar. All these pixels, these are white pixels, they will belong to the same cluster. The black part here also probably belongs to the same regions because all the pixels are black, and so on and so forth. Now, we should keep in mind that here we are not trying to label the pixels with some semantic label. We are not trying to say that these pixels are grass pixels. We are not saying that these pixels are, say, a tree pixel. These pixels belong to grass. We're not saying that. We're just grouping together pixels according to the similarity in terms of color, okay? Without any attempt at assigning a class label. Now, we can see this problem in terms of clustering because now the objects to be clustered are the pixels in my image. Now, each pixel, as we mentioned before, is represented by 3 numbers. 3 numbers, as you know, represent a point in a 3-dimensional space. So each pixel can be thought of as a point in a 3-dimensional space, where the 3 axes are the red, the green, and the blue axis. And so once you see the problem in this way, you can run your favorite clustering algorithm, which will take into account the similarity or the distance, if you like, in this case, between pixels, and then it will return the clusters. And these clusters will represent regions of your image whereby the colors are approximately the same. This is a very important problem in a number of problems in many areas, in image processing, computer vision, and so on and so forth. And now we're going to see one of the standard ways to solve this problem, which is an algorithm which goes back probably to the 60s, if not earlier. It's an algorithm, by the way, sorry, that you can download from the internet, and you can play with that straight away. It's very efficient. It is one of the most popular algorithms around. And this algorithm is called k-means. We're going to see why this is called this way. Now I'm going to tell you how it works. I'm going to tell you the different steps the algorithm is composed of. It's the first algorithm that we're going to see in this course. And it works in the following way. It's an iterative algorithm, which in the first step, which is the initialization step, it picks randomly k points where k is the number of clusters. So that's the first thing that I need to mention about this algorithm. And the fact is that in order for you to use k-means, you have to know in advance the number of clusters, which is the k. The k that you see here is just a number of clusters. So in this particular approach, you have to know the number of clusters in advance. And so the objective is to partition the input data into k different clusters. So first step, initialization. You choose k random points, randomly or pseudo-randomly, with some smart way. And then you decide that these points are the centers of your clusters. And then there are these 2 steps, which are iterated for a while until convergence. Step number 1, you assign all the data points to the closest cluster center, which basically means you take your points in your data set, you measure the distance between your points and the k random cluster centers that you've chosen before, and then you assign that point to the closest cluster center, okay? In this way, you have created a partition of the input data into k different clusters. Then, once you have your clusters, you recalculate your cluster centers. And the recalculation simply means that you compute the average of the points within each cluster. And then you keep going this way. So these two steps are alternated and they are iterated for a while until there are the algorithm stops and the situation, the partition that you are getting becomes stable. Now, I'm going to show you an example of how this works. Here you go. We have a bunch of data. This is your data set, a bunch of points on the plane, all with the same color. Remember, we don't have any label here. And we want to partition this data set into two distinct clusters, say the blue cluster and the red cluster. So step number one of the algorithm, choose k, well, k now is equal to 2, choose two random points as cluster centers. And suppose that the algorithm chooses this point here and this point here. These are the two initial random points, right? Then the algorithm does the following thing. For each point in the data set, say, take this point, and you measure the distance between this point and the blue cluster center. And then you measure the distance between this point and the red cluster center. The closest one is this one, right? So I decide to assign this point to the blue cluster center. And if I take another point, say this one, I measure the distance between this and that, this and that. The red one is the closest, so I assign this point to the red cluster. So imagine I do this for all the points in the data set. Eventually, you get a partition, which is this one. So these are all the points that are closer to the cluster center, this, and these are all the points that are closer to the red cluster center. And this is a partition. Now, second step, remember there are this is step number one. Now we consider step number two. We recalculate the cluster center for this blue cluster by just taking the average of all the points. Sometimes this is called the center of mass or the barycenter of these points. And you do the same for this. And this gives you two new cluster centers. This is the new cluster center for the blue cluster, and this is the new cluster center for the red cluster. And now you repeat the same thing we did before. For each point in the data set, I compute the distance between the point and the two cluster centers, and I assign the point to the closest cluster center. So for example, this point here, which was originally in the previous step assigned to the red cluster, if you compute now the distance between this point and the two cluster centers, now this is closer to the blue cluster center than to the red. So in the new step, this point will get assigned to the blue cluster. So you repeat this stuff for all the points, and eventually now you get a new partition of the data. So these are two new clusters, the red one and the blue one. And now we recompute the cluster centers. The new cluster centers are these two. And that's the end of the story. Once you arrive here, the situation from now on will no longer change, and then the algorithm stops. Okay, so that's a practical practical visualization of how k-means work on a very toy example. And you see the algorithm at the end of the day was able to partition the data set into two clusters, the red one and the blue one. Now, remember, I mentioned before that the algorithm, the clustering algorithm, finds many applications, one of which is image segmentation. And here is an example of how k-means, the algorithm that I just showed before, works on a simple image segmentation image segmentation problem. This is the input image. And of course, there are regions that are green regions that are red, regions that are, I don't know, violet, and so on and so forth. So if we cluster our image based on color, this is what you would get. This is a whole cluster, and this is another cluster, this is another cluster, and so on and so forth. Of course, you can even choose to cluster on intensity instead of colors. So you forget about the color and you just use the intensity of the image. In case you imagine you have a black and white image or intensity-based image, and that's the result using only intensity and not using color. Of course, it's up to you what kind of features you want to use to measure the similarity between the pixels. Okay, I think now we have to have a second break.